With all of the undercarriage work this 20K needs and some of the shady work that was done by previous owners, Mac and I have decided to put this thing back together correctly. So we're going to be removing this drive so we can rebuild all of the undercarriage. But we're also going to be adding some components to this that are original to the machine that currently they're not on the machine right now. So hopefully you follow along and see the changes that we make, including the painting that we're going to be doing with this machine as well before it goes into the grader. With the weight off the machine, we can easily get that track shaft out. So it looks like the horizontal spring here for load for the idler is broken. Didn't know that before, so again, another good reason why it's a good idea to do all the work that we're going to be doing to it. Someone has done some horrible welding on this track adjusting perch. We're going to fix it correctly as well. We need to remove the dowel pins from the older housing or use our dowel pin puller, but we need to heat them up first to get them out. There we go. With all the rollers off the undercarriage, our goal today is to get them apart, get them cleaned up, then make arrangements to get them up to Summit Point, West Virginia to Mike McGee's shop and start machining to get all these straightened out. All of these rollers have washers that fold over to lock the nut in place. We'll need to straighten these before we can remove the nuts. Since all the roller axles are tapered, it takes a considerable amount of pressure to press these apart. So we're using a bearing separator under one of the rollers while we're using a hydraulic press to press it apart. And that's the amount of pressure that it does take to get these things apart. So now without the bearing separator, we'll be able to put the other side directly on a couple of plates and then press out the other half. This is necessary because we cannot get the caps apart without getting the rollers off first. This is the second side of that roller. This time we're using plates to support the roller while we press the axle out. We're also doing it the same way with the flat rollers. We're ready to put the bearing back into our Cletrac housing. Before you put any bearing back into surfaces like this, you want to make sure that where the bearing race sits, that it's nice and clean and it sits flush to the machine surface, because if you don't, that'll put the bearing off center and that can cause premature wear of the bearing and possibly even the shaft. We got the bearing itself nice and clean and put into place. Now we're going to get something to drive the outside of the race to push it down. So we've got a brass punch and a small sledgehammer, working back and forth, only hitting the race. You can hear how the sound got much deeper, a thump sound to it, where we know the bearing is seated. And what's really interesting about this is you'll see as we put it back together, it's got a series of washers that hold the outer race tight in the housing. The bearing for the out drive is put in and torqued down. We got safety wire on 2 of them. We just have to safety wire the other 2. Then we can put the assembly together. And here's our new bearing put on our axle shaft. And that's all going to go together at the same time. The 2 bolts on the right side have been safety wired. Now we're going to do the other 2. You always need to make sure you have enough wire. There's always going to be some waste. So with the wire pulled through this direction, we want the wire to tighten this way. So we're going to bring this one around the nut, like so. And then we will begin by twisting these 2 wires before we connect to the other bolt. Most of you have seen me do this before, but this is a little more challenging in that it's recessed into a housing. With this one pulled around to the right side of the bolt, we're going to now use our safety wire pliers and give it a few twists. Alright, so now we'll let this go. And this is why it's important to have extra wire so we can pull this back around through the bolt and then twist to finish it off. With the wire pulled through the bolt on this side and then wrapped around the opposite direction, I'm going to use a screwdriver to hold that down a little bit. Since we're recessed, it makes it a little more difficult. Then I'm going to twist this end of the wire, get it tight through that bolt. Okay. Then cut off the excess, and then there we are. It's nice and tight. So what happens here is if this bolt tries to loosen, it pulls this wire, which will in turn tighten this, and if this one tries to loosen, it will then in turn pull this one tight. That way they always stay tight. Now with our drive axle in place, through the new bearing, we can put in our thrust washer and our first spacer. That's going to help put preload on that center race. The next piece to go on is the bull gear. With the bull gear in place, it's time to put on the other spacer. And then we're going to add our new bearing, so that'll be supported from the inside. With that bearing pressed in place, we put on this thrust washer. And it's time to add the nut and the cotter pin to lock all this in place. Here Mac is tapping the housing onto the dowel pins before putting in the bolts and drawing it up tight. Ready to put the shield on for the axle. You'll notice that this portion of it actually presses against the outer race of the bearing here, and that's what's going to keep the in-play correct, and it's also going to keep it tight into the housing. You also see we're using sealer on these. There are no gaskets available for them, and I could have made them, but sealer is going to work fine for here. We'll make some gaskets for other components later. The upgrade for this housing is done. The only thing left to do is to put the drive sprocket on, but we need to get a rope seal for it before we can put that in place. So for right now, that's all we're going to do to this side. I'm ready to start tearing the engine apart on this 51 Cub. I've got the coolant drained and the oil drained. Now we're ready to start taking the head off. I got all the head bolts detorqued in the opposite direction of torquing them. It's just a good practice so you don't warp the head. It's unlikely on a head like this, but it's, again, still a good practice to work on from the outside in. I kept some of the components hooked to it so it makes it a lot easier to pull it off as an assembly. So let's see if we can get it off here. There we go. Next I'll pull the oil pan off so we can start taking the pistons out. With the oil pan off, I can remove the rod caps and then get the pistons out so we can inspect them. We've got the specifications, so we're going to measure the piston and the cylinder and see if we just need to re-ring it or if we have to get pistons as well. I just picked this up last night. This is a 1932 John Deere D. I'm very happy to own it. I got one out of Michigan a little over a year ago at an auction, but this one is in much better condition, and plus it's on steel wheels where the other one was converted to rubber. This one even still has the original cast iron intake system for it and filtering system. Very happy with that. And this thing was less than 20 minutes from my house. I've been sitting there a long time, and you just never know what you drive by every day on your way to work. Here's the Harley finally done. I've taken it on a couple of rides. It's doing very well. A couple little minor things I need to take care of and give it a good detailing, but otherwise it's a good solid bike. Here's what I did to the back of it. The purists aren't going to be too happy about it, but it's a pretty accurate statement. Next time on Bulldog Builds, we'll have that other drive put back together and installed on the 20K. We're going to make a trip to Pennsylvania to Zimmerman's Cletrac to pick up a few parts to make the restoration better on our 20. And we'll mic out the pistons and cylinders on that Cub to see what we need to do to get it running well again. See you next week.